What am I? Part 3. The Way Revealed. Lord, said Thomas, we do not know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. For those of us not familiar with this passage, or even Christianity, this quote may sound cryptic, nonsensical even. Jesus didn't just declare, after all, that he knew some truth, did some way or technique, or possessed some unique life that would grant him exclusive passage back to the Father. He stated that he was those qualities, the living embodiment. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and that the only way back to reality was through him, the I am. But what could this statement possibly mean? To those of us familiar with Christianity, and this quote in particular, we might be tempted to interpret this as a command to follow him, believe in him, worship him. This passage is, after all, one of the cornerstones of Christianity, and in order to be a Christian, it has been frequently stated that at the very least, one must believe in Jesus, seek him, and even try to emulate him, if that individual is to have any hope of getting into heaven. This is not to suggest that this interpretation is wrong, incidentally, as there's certainly great power in aligning our intent with a divine figure. And we already know from our exploration of self that multiple points of observation can and do exist and have validity. Besides, Jesus could have simply been establishing himself as an advocate for all those who might seek him and follow his teachings. But is this really the whole story? What if Jesus was trying to convey a deeper truth with this statement? Thomas certainly didn't need to start following him after all. He was already a disciple, having given up his livelihood, his reputation, and perhaps even his own physical safety. He certainly believed in him, even if he still had his doubts. So what could he do that he wasn't already doing? And where was Jesus going that he couldn't already follow? Let us consider for a moment the possibility that this response was also an invitation, intended for a more select audience that could potentially implement the rigorous set of requirements involved. By stating what he was, I am the way, the truth, and the life, we tacitly discover what he wasn't: a doer of ways, a knower of truth, or a possessor of life. Jesus seems to be implying here that these modes of operating in the world can only take us so far. Something within us has to change, transform. Like Jesus and all the other saints, mystics, and sages throughout the ages who have tread this same path, we too must become these qualities so that we might also come to the Father, to absolute reality, through the only door that is available to us, the I am. In Part 2, we explored the various ways by which duality presents itself to us, in our language, our conflicting desires and concepts, and through the different voices in our head that work to shape and influence the story of our lives. We also worked to expose the fallaciousness of some of these voices by observing how they often work to conceal or directly oppose our truer selves. We discovered that the existence of some of these voices are only revealed through collision and crisis, and that crisis is sometimes the only way to break through. And finally, we examined the major dualistic hurdles and perceptual stages that stand before us, that of body, mind, and being, which become progressively more abstract and difficult to transcend as we get closer and closer to the source. In Part 3, we will explore the 3 avenues by which we should work simultaneously: the way, the truth, and the life, in order that we might also arrive at the state of consciousness known as the I am. We will examine the way in which we can more effectively conserve and transmute our physical energy in order to strengthen our bodies and enhance our powers of concentration and intuition. we will delve deeper into the truth about this philosophical concept that we call duality, outlining the process of mental triangulation that we can use to arrive at higher states of consciousness. And we will also look at the life of a truth seeker, the advantages and disadvantages of working in groups, along with the benefits of giving and receiving. Let us now continue our journey by examining the first I am requirement on our list, the way. Continuing our exploration of self, we observe that all of life, including human civilization, is built on the transmutation of energy, progressing from simple, rudimentary forms of life through increasingly more complex and sophisticated forms. Known in biology as the energy pyramid, we witness this transmutation of energy take place first and foremost through consumption. From relatively simple life forms that reside at the base of the pyramid and live off sunlight, such as plants and some bacteria, also known as producers, through progressively more complex life forms that occupy the middle tiers but live off the levels below them, consumers. At the top of the pyramid, we see extremely complex and sophisticated forms of life known as apex predators, who do not appear to be actively hunted by anything at all. Each step up this pyramid requires vast quantities of energy and life from the step below it. While a protozoa could eat up to 10,000 bacteria a day, a typical earthworm might consume several hundred protozoans a day. A wild turkey, on the other hand, could consume up to a pound of food a day, consisting of hundreds of earthworms, insects, nuts, seeds, and fruits, while a grown turkey could likely feed the average human for several days. But why all of this carnage? It would appear that this raw energy, which first arrives to us as sunlight, must go through a lengthy refining process in order to bring into being the biological machinery necessary to support our current level of perception and intelligence. We see evidence of this process manifested by the various forms of life, moving through increasing levels of complexity and sophistication. As to the ultimate purpose or function of this refining process, we don't honestly know, though we can speculate as to the ultimate designs based on the progression we've observed so far. We also don't know for certain where this refining process ends, or if it ever does. Regardless, there's no denying that the biological laboratory known to us as Mother Nature took a lot of time and energy to create us, especially when you consider just how many life forms and transmutations were ultimately required to achieve this end. Acknowledging this trend, we must also observe that a similar progression of energy transmutation appears to be taking place within us as well, from crude, unrefined forms of energy to that which is more subtle. Food, for example, is transformed into physical energy, which is in turn transformed into glandular energy, which is transformed into mental energy, which can then potentially be transformed into spiritual energy, or something as yet undefined. Much like an oil refinery that would crack its raw crude oil into more refined yet useful forms, we also appear to perform a similar refinement of the energy we take in to our own bodies. Although our own energy accumulation, storage, and refinement process is mostly automatic, as determined by the structure of our own biological machinery, it can be altered by diet, behavior, along with several other factors. We do have some conscious control over it. We can enhance it. This process, if managed in a more conscious way, is referred to as the raising of the Kundalini, according to Indian philosophy. In Chinese philosophy, it is known as the cultivation of qi or qi. These enhancement systems consist principally of 3 steps: modifying our diet, accumulation, monitoring our energy losses, conservation, and improving our powers of observation, refinement. Education, for example, is an energy refining method that we're all familiar with. but there are others. With education, we observe that we must restrict and control our desire for physical expression if we're going to cultivate our intellect. Put simply, we need to sit still and study if we're going to develop the mind. Physical development, on the other hand, requires control and regulation of our diet, but work in the form of exercise is also required. All of these energy refining systems require a form of restriction or control in order to function, but effort at the desired level of development is also required. In order to provide further context on this topic, let us consider now the following ways in which energy at its various stages can be utilized or expended. Physical energy is used primarily for physical labor, endurance, and strength. Physical energy highly refined results in great physical prowess, agility, and power. Mental energy is used for the cultivation of the intellect, reason, logic. Mental energy highly refined results in genius. Sexual or glandular energy is used for reproduction and body awareness, intuition. We recognize this type of energy as personal magnetism. Individuals born with high sex drives, for example, often exhibit these qualities. Sexual or glandular energy highly refined can be used for advanced forms of concentration or perception beyond the range of the average individual. Advanced forms of perception are usually not understood or commonly accepted in Western culture, but may include telepathy, astral projection, or excite, clairvoyance, unique healing capabilities, experiences of synchronicity and bliss, along with other experiences of non-ordinary reality. The cultivation of qi, or ki, as illustrated by various Asian philosophies, likewise gives the practitioner the ability to perform unusual feats of strength and agility, as manifested by the various martial arts traditions. With sufficient energy and refinement, perception may appear serendipitous and even miraculous. Although not exactly within our conscious control, these new perceptual capabilities emerge as part of a progression, experienced by those rare individuals who have stored and refined enough of their own energy in order to make the leap. This is the realm of both saints and mystics. Now, in order to transform the body into an instrument that's capable of perceiving these increasingly subtle concepts and impressions, we too must take steps to collect, conserve, and refine our own energy to the best of our abilities. This includes proper diet, abstaining from drugs and alcohol, sufficient exercise, the reduction or temporary elimination of sexual activity and ideation, along with the reduction of negative emotions, either external or internal. All of these steps should ideally be coupled with an energy refining system that is appropriate for the constitution and temperament of the individual. This is the way. The topic of sex, however, requires special attention, as the orgasm is one of the biggest ways in which we naturally lose energy and disrupt our ability to observe accurately, especially if it's indulged in excessively, and especially for men, as they tend to feel the effects almost immediately. Women, on the other hand, don't appear to get impacted as significantly, but whatever impact they do feel is usually delayed for several days, so it may be more difficult to make the connection. The orgasm can tax the reward circuitry of our brains, resulting in a large drop in dopamine, along with a rise in prolactin. Surprisingly, it can take up to 2 weeks to recover from this neurochemical crash before we return to homeostasis. In the paraphrased words of author Marnia Robinson from her book Cupid's Poisoned Arrow, during this recovery phase, lovers may feel needy, irritable, anxious, or depleted. This phase is nearly invisible to sexually active adults, though, because our first instinct is to try and resolve any uneasiness with another orgasm. Unfortunately, this recovery period, as described by Marnia, is not ideal for spiritual inquiry. It would be like placing our observer telescopes on unstable ground. We can't observe to the best of our abilities if our own shifting neurochemistry is constantly shaking the lens. This is not to say that profound transformative experiences can't be had through sex, nor is this observation simply sexual prudishness masquerading as truth, as sex per se is not really the primary obstacle here, only the orgasm. Periods of temporary abstention are highly recommended. Sex without orgasm, on the other hand, does not have to be eliminated. Author Napoleon Hill, from his book Think and Grow Rich, which is among the top 10 best-selling self-help books of all time, informs us that sex is the number one mind stimulant that we have. The hokey pokey really is what it's all about, as it turns out. Hill states, when driven by this desire, men develop keenness of imagination, courage, willpower, persistence, and creative ability unknown to them at other times. So strong and impelling is the desire for sexual contact that men freely run the risk of life and reputation to indulge it. Chapter 11, The Mystery of Sex Transmutation, tells us everything we need to know. Conserve this sexual energy at all costs. Do not dissipate it if you wish to maximize your chance at success in any endeavor. This includes spiritual endeavor as well. Famous figures like Gandhi, Newton, Tesla, Beethoven, and even Steve Jobs have all testified to this truth. One final point before we leave this topic, as it is a controversial one. It is important to keep in mind that nature has no vested interest in our personal ambitions for self-actualization or enlightenment. Its primary focus is the expenditure of one's allotted energy through reproduction and the perpetuation of the species. To this end, it will use pleasure as bait to accomplish its goals. One must be quite clever if it's their intent to sidestep nature's will. If the idea of reducing pleasure, especially sexual pleasure, offends you, ask yourself why. Consider for a moment whether you're really the one doing the consuming here, or are you being consumed? Who really profits from these large exchanges of energy? Once energy accumulation and conservation have been addressed, one also needs to examine the various energy refining systems that have been developed over the centuries and begin to implement one or more of them if they haven't already. Some of these systems include mantras, which is the repetition of a spiritually aligned expression; affirmations, the repetition of a positive intention or desire; prayer, a dialogue with a divine being or entity, generally in the form of a request or as an expression of gratitude; devotion, a spiritually aligned act or intention, such as singing, dancing, or other rituals; dream recall, the investigation of one's dreams, usually for the purpose of gaining psychological insight from the unconscious mind; journaling, the act of recording one's thoughts and emotions and reflecting on them; psychotherapy, along with other forms of talk therapy, an investigative and exploratory process that we can participate in either one-on-one or within a group for the purpose of gaining psychological insight, used primarily to help resolve or mitigate troublesome behaviors, beliefs, compulsions, thoughts, or emotions. Intellectual inquiry, used primarily for the development of reason and discernment, but also used to provide us with a possible roadmap to greater insight and truth. Common systems of thought initially investigated for the purpose of discovering truth include theology, metaphysics, philosophy, and psychology, but may include several other systems as well. Concentration, or one-pointedness of mind, the practice of learning to fixate one's mind or attention unwaveringly on a given object. Meditation, the practice of learning to watch one's mind and body from a state of non-attachment for the purpose of observing how these systems operate. Not to be confused with visualization, however, which seeks to consciously project onto the mind specific desires or states of mind. Contemplation, the practice of remaining mentally fixed on a particular truth or insight for a prolonged period of time. Contemplation is primarily a background process and can be engaged in while performing other tasks. Meditation or one-pointedness of mind, on the other hand, are foreground activities and require our complete attention. And finally, spiritual teachers and groups, a collaboration of like-minded individuals who meet for the primary purpose of exchanging information, challenging assumptions, channeling and focusing group energy, addressing problem areas, and providing overall morale and support. Whatever system or systems one might choose, it goes without saying that a home life that's free from excessive stress and anxiety is extremely beneficial. We need a stable and supportive environment from which to study and reflect. Steady progress also depends on consistent effort. This requires a lifestyle that supports this endeavor and time set aside each day to do the work. Disruptive states of mind, such as distraction, fatigue, rationalization, and laziness, must also be examined and overcome. It would seem that the mind does not really want to know itself, as it will actively resist any attempts at serious self-inquiry. We must address these disruptive states by developing our own set of tactics to counter them. We might, for example, introduce variety or a change of approach to combat distraction, request support from our fellow seekers to tackle rationalization and negative emotions, or implement a system of rewards to assist with laziness. Like a hunter that stalks its prey and knows its routines, we too must become familiar enough with our own behavior to develop a system of checks and balances to keep ourselves on track. Whatever works, we do. While it could be argued that all of the systems listed here are valid, useful, and can serve us at different points in our life, some systems do appear to be more effective than others. Mantras, affirmations, and visualizations, for example, can certainly be beneficial, but usually only provide value up to a certain point. Their focus is normally oriented towards experiencing some specific objective or emotion, like relaxation, happiness, or success. And while these types of systems can and do temporarily calm and sedate the body, or help to manifest some desired outcome, this approach rarely leads to greater understanding about ourselves. We arrive at ultimate truth not by projecting onto the universe what we want, but by removing that which we know to be fallacious. Just like a sculptor and his block of stone, we too must arrive at reality by chipping away at the unnecessary bits, one piece at a time. The systems that are the most effective tend to be the most dynamic and involve examining the mind and questioning our own motives and assumptions. Self-inquiry is a rigorous and investigative process after all. It is not passive, nor is it a script that can be easily recited. It is a highly creative and evolving process. As we will discover, there is a lot of spiritual fiction out there that must be waded through and discarded. The cultivation of discernment is key. Intellectual inquiry, contemplation, and working with like-minded teachers and groups are all systems that tend to support this type of approach the best. In summary, the way is primarily an energy accumulation, conservation, and refining system used to enhance our current perceptual capabilities, so as to enable us to experience more advanced forms of consciousness. We accumulate energy principally through consumption, by eating foods that are good for us. We conserve our energy by avoiding those substances or behaviors that would deplete us, including negative emotions and people. And we refine our energy through intense concentration and self-inquiry. Although we've probably heard it many times before, our body really is our temple. If we have enough energy, can refine it sufficiently, and have an accurate roadmap, we can use it as a vehicle to approach divinity. Shifting our attention now, we move to the next I am requirement on the list, the truth. Hubert Benoit, the French psychotherapist and philosopher, wrote in his book The Supreme Doctrine that all dualities possess a conciliatory point, a point of observation that exists above the two perceived opposites yet contains and reconciles both. This conciliatory point represents a superior point of observation, as it is closer to the source of our existence. If discovered, it can offer the seeker a much more accurate and comprehensive mode of perception. In order to understand this concept more clearly, we picture now a triangle with the polarities of both love and hate, or affection and aversion, representing the base, points A and B. Point C is the apex of the triangle and represents the new, superior, but as yet undiscovered point of observation. Discovering this conciliatory point can be likened to a surveyor who would use their understanding of trigonometry and known distances on the ground to determine the height of a nearby mountain. Just like the surveyor, we triangulate our way to new unknown points of observation by starting with two known points of observation, the polarity of opposites. This process of triangulation is known as the conciliatory principle. It is a method by which all of our dualisms can be eventually transcended and recontextualized. If pursued diligently, it can eventually return us to the absolute state of awareness, to enlightenment. By using the mind to observe the mind, we counter our brain's natural proclivity to divide by adroitly using that which would divide us against itself. We use duality against duality. 2 divided by 2 becomes 1. When this process is applied successfully, we become non-attached from the dualistic form of perception which had previously gripped our entire attention. We retreat a step back from our error and we actually see our mind performing the mental manipulation and division. Once we see it, however, we now have the freedom to no longer identify with it. Our sense of self changes. Unfortunately, the process isn't quite this simple, as the exact formula necessary to complete the triangulation is different for each person. We don't know precisely what approach will work for us, as the keys necessary to unlock each mind are all slightly different. We do know, however, that we can narrow the search considerably by consulting with teachers who have already made the journey, by reading books that would help to deepen our understanding of self, by persistently asking questions about why we think what we think, and by obsessively monitoring our own thoughts and life experiences. As a general rule, the more effort we put into the quest, the better our chances become of making significant progress. Intuition plays a significant role too and should not be discounted. If used, it will help guide us to that which we need most. By now, we should recognize that that which we're seeking is also seeking us. We are being helped. Just like the One Ring from Tolkien's book, The Lord of the Rings, the ring, like us, also wants to be found. After a long and seemingly futile struggle, we do eventually stumble on to the correct point of reference and are rewarded for our effort by transitioning to a new point of observation above the given duality. Affection and aversion in this example are no longer perceived as opposite feelings that we temporarily identify with. we have taken a step back from these more turbulent feelings and have discovered a superior and more complete understanding, which we label here as compassion. We see now the whole spectrum of human emotion, and with that sight comes a certain degree of emotional control and detachment that we didn't have before. We also observe a much greater concern and empathy for the human condition, and especially for those who cannot see as we now do. But this discovery does not lead to a feeling of boastfulness or excessive pride, however, or even a compulsion to fix all the injustices that we may perceive. For in the words of author Dr. Brené Brown, we observe that we all are doing the best we can, given our model of the world. This specific example of triangulation is just one of thousands, perhaps even millions, for we can polarize our perception of the world in a number of different ways. However, this example does represent our first major hurdle on the path, our notions of good and evil, love and hate, positive and negative. In part 2, we addressed only the major dualistic hurdles and perceptual milestones that one would encounter on their journey back to the Absolute. But there are a number of others. If properly applied, we can use the conciliatory principle to arrive at beauty, power, success, genius, healing, wisdom, and other more sophisticated states of consciousness as well. In fact, we are already using it, and we probably don't even know it. For example, we observe here that we already gravitate to the midpoint or apex of perceived physical opposites, both natural and man-made. These midpoints are special to us, for they offer to us a sense of beauty, power, and enhanced awareness. Sunrise and sunset, for example, represent the midpoint between day and night. They are typically seen as beautiful. It is during this twilight period that we tend to perceive a heightened sense of beauty, love, mystery, and magic. It is no coincidence that a certain movie that would seek to represent these qualities would name itself after such a specific time of day. Water and land represent the midpoint between that which is perceived as stable versus that which is always changing, order and chaos. Property that gives us a waterside view is almost always highly prized. In the presence of water, whether it be a river, pond, lake, or ocean, we perceive a sense of beauty, majesty, transformation, or stillness. We perceive our own mortality too, as the changing of the tides or the flow of the stream, life and death. Again, it is no coincidence that Mark Twain would choose the Mississippi River as his background to represent the transformation of both Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. Mountains and valleys represent to us the juxtaposition of tremendous height or sheer power and size against its perceived opposite. In the presence of a mountain, we tend to feel a sense of awe or wonder. Interior design seeks to balance form and function, that which is natural with that which is artificial. By striking a proper balance between these two requirements, we arrive at a feeling of serenity. We are at home, cozy, comfortable. The philosophy of feng shui tries to take this a step further by attempting to harmonize not only the dualities of form and function, but also the dualities of our own internal psychic landscape as well, both within the home and the surrounding environment. Gardens likewise try to arrive at this midpoint by balancing the order of human aesthetics and productivity with the chaos of nature left unimpeded, order and chaos. This last duality in particular is unique and may present itself to us in a variety of different ways. By walking the fine line between both order and chaos in our own lives, we cultivate personal power. The vacation that provides the perfect balance of adventure and relaxation enriches us. The relationship that balances both excitement and security invigorates us. and the career that pushes us to grow yet provides some predictability satisfies us. Honoring the needs of both order and chaos in our own lives is a tricky affair, though. Our own personal life story is always evolving, and the balance required is not always clear. Sometimes the best approach, however, is just to stake a claim and make a choice, knowing full well that it may be the wrong choice. We do this with the understanding that sometimes the fastest way to know who and what we are is by discovering what we're not. There's value in the error. Moving on, we observe that the conciliatory principle can be applied to non-physical goals and objectives just as easily as physical ones. When it comes to romantic relationships, for example, the polarity of come hither and go away, desire versus rejection, when distributed in the correct proportion, often leads to an aura of intrigue and attraction with a potential mate. When it comes to business, we discover that unceasing effort towards some goal, coupled with a non-attached and unconcerned attitude in regards to the outcome of that goal, will often result in success. Total action in doing is triangulated against total inaction in feeling. This is usually the attitude taken by most successful CEOs. Learning to triangulate the polarity of awake and asleep can also be particularly eye-opening, as we discover a midpoint between both, called the hypnagogic state. Learning to keep our attention fixed on this state can lead to other perceptual oddities as well, including lucid dreaming, out-of-body projection, and remote viewing. When it comes to human behavior, we take heed of Aristotle's insight and observe that moral virtue only comes through the mean, the midpoint between the extremes of both deficiency and excess, which are labeled as vices. Our notion of virtue is also a triangulation of perceived behavioral opposites. Cowardice and rashness, for example, if properly triangulated, becomes courage. We often see these types of moral triangulations occur in movies, where one character personifies the deficiency of the virtue, the other the excess, while the main protagonist personifies the midpoint or virtue itself. Sometimes the virtue is arrived at through transformation, where one or two characters start off with either deficiency or excess, but then evolve towards the mean together. We see this type of transformation occur in romantic comedies all the time. Citing a few more examples of virtue, we also note that indifference and controlling, if successfully triangulated, become caring. Lying and tactlessness become truthful. Timid and domineering become confident. Fearful and impulsive become patient. Naive and cynical become practical. And fickle and gullible become loyal. We observe here that the reverse is also true. Virtue, any virtue taken to an extreme, ends up becoming a vice. Tolerance, if taken too far, can paradoxically become its opposite and come to represent either the apologist, who ends up trying to defend truly evil acts by arguing from a position of moral relativism that anything is permissible given one's culture, or can come to represent the moral zealot, who from their own sense of moral superiority ends up chastising or demonizing anyone who disagrees with their position. The tolerant, through excessive tolerance, ironically become intolerant. The optimal form of political governance is also a triangulation between the needs of the individual and that of the collective. By balancing both capitalistic as well as social systems, we maximize the greatest good for all. The Latin phrase, e pluribus unum, out of many, one, which is located on all U.S. coinage, touches upon this duality. We are many states, comprised of many individuals with many different laws, interests, and perspectives, but we have also come together as one, with a common vision, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But like the order and chaos duality, this balance is also not static. It changes according to context. The ratio will change depending on whether we're at war or at peace, whether the economy is booming or busting, along with many other considerations. Dialogue between the varying perspectives must be maintained in order to properly determine this context. This is why freedom of speech and the rooting out of sophistry is so important. Society can't accurately determine this context and the appropriate balance if the flow of information is either impaired or deliberately distorted. Last but not least, we have the existential dualities. These dualities guard the doorway to such exalted states as cosmic consciousness, self-actualization, and enlightenment. If successfully triangulated, they can transport us to profoundly transformative states of consciousness, to peace, a feeling of oneness, along with absolute realizations about the nature of our existence, beyond our perception of both time and space. These dualities include thought versus no thought, existence versus non-existence, everything versus nothing, and life versus death. By now you might be thinking, okay, enough. I get it. I accept this premise. But how do I really put this method into practice and realize the benefits? In order to put the conciliatory principle to work, one must first start by seeing clearly the duality under observation. So this is step one. If no duality in particular comes to mind, it may be useful to start by examining our problems or our prejudice. What convictions do we hold? What assumptions? Is there a particular issue in our own life that we're struggling with? We recall from our earlier discovery about perception that dualistic notions often present themselves to us through our experience of conflict and crisis. This is a good place to start looking. Mental triangulation, it should be clarified, is not about meeting perfectly in the middle, though. This is just a way of expressing the concept. We're not trying to evenly balance the scales here, identifying with equal number of positions from either side of the divide. Nor are we trying to convert to the other side of a given topic either. We're trying to find the point of true reconciliation, the purest governing principle that ties the two mentalized positions together. Once that point is truly discovered, understanding and transformation are sure to follow. The notion that all people are doing the best they can, given their model of the world, is an example of one such governing principle as it applies to our dualistic concept of good and evil. It does not excuse evil, nor does it say that good and evil don't exist. What it does do is recontextualize the whole spectrum of morality by acknowledging that this duality is governed by a superior point of observation, that we are all ignorant to varying degrees, and that this ignorance is oftentimes out of our control. From this new position, we feel compassion and pity, both for ourselves and others, because we now recognize that we don't always see things clearly ourselves, and this lack of clarity often leads to great error and suffering. Jesus stated this reality plainly when he called out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." On to step 2. Intend to discover it. One could say this is a bit like wishing upon a star, and they wouldn't be too far off. But we must at least want to discover this new superior point of observation. It must be a strong desire that we actually have. We may discover along the way that we really don't want to surrender our position on the matter, because we secretly enjoy the pleasure of feeling right or certain. This discovery could be very painful, and giving up that pleasure might be difficult. Learning to surrender the pleasure of various positions is a significant part of the process. The act of intention, however, should not be underestimated, as it will bring up thoughts, emotions, and experiences into our lives that will help to facilitate this discovery. Intent works kind of like a homing beacon. Once activated from a position of sincerity, it will start the process. These experiences we receive may be unpleasant, or they may be wonderful. They will be whatever is required, but they will come, so the best advice is to pay attention. Step 3. Work like hell. Once the intention has been set, it is our responsibility to try to discover the new point of observation to the best of our abilities through action. Effort must be exerted. We do this by reading books, collaborating with others, monitoring our thoughts, meditating, and questioning our beliefs and assumptions. Basically everything we can think to do to gain more insight. By now, many of us have probably heard expressions like, "There's nothing to do and there's nowhere to go," or "just be," or even "we are all one." Yes, these statements are true from a certain perspective, but they were all observed from a very high point of observation. These statements, in all likelihood, are not true for you, at least not yet. Which is to say, they're not a part of your subjective experience of reality. One may be tempted to adopt one of these slogans in a desire to avoid further effort, but this is another trick of the mind. The error here is in mixing levels of observation. As has been mentioned previously, different points of observation possess different qualities and capabilities, but also different limitations. Effort, as a function of doingness, is still a requirement for the points of observation that most people currently reside in. The mind may try and obscure this reality by imagining that it's in a different point of observation with different requirements than it really is, but this is only imagination. This is sort of like imagining that you're rich and fantasizing about what you would do with all the money. While it may be helpful to use our knowledge of advanced states of consciousness as a roadmap for upcoming perceptual opportunities and challenges, this roadmap should not be confused with our current reality. The map is not the territory. To confuse the two is a mistake. Step 4. Surrender it. After a long and seemingly futile struggle to discover this new reality, a moment does come when we realize that we've done everything that we can do to encourage this new point of perspective. Thankfully, we will know when this moment arrives. At this point, and only at this point, we must surrender our intention and stop all effort. This experience is like a great sigh, or exhaling of breath. In all likelihood, we'll feel like we've failed. We may feel profoundly depressed, or perhaps even a sense of great relief. It is during this period, however, when all hope seemingly has been lost, that the mind gives up its control for a moment and the transformation comes. Looking over our notes, we observe that the truth begins as a map that we must struggle to create and solidify in our own minds, in order that we might use it to help guide us back to the highest reality, to what we really are. But this map should not be confused with a territory. Knowledge must not be confused with experience. We must also walk this path that we discover, in our deeds, our speech, and in our hearts, in order that we might experience the transformative effects of truth. While it may be true that we know the route from Portland to Seattle, let's say, we have to actually make the trip in order for it to become a part of us. The truth involves both knowing and living. This path back to reality is first presented to us as a series of dualistic gates that we perceive as mental divisions or opposites, and that we must reconcile and transcend in order to progress. We use the conciliatory principle that has been described here in order to move to the next level of observation. It is a process of mental triangulation. These perceptual gates become progressively more abstract and difficult to transcend, however, the farther we go. There are fewer and fewer teachers or guides at each step available to assist us. At a sufficiently high point of observation, there may be no one available to assist us at all. These gates can be roughly divided into three categories: body-focused, mind-focused, and being-focused. These are the major gates, the major transition points. There are also many minor gates, but there are far too many to mention them all here. Suffice it to say, every abstract concept that we deem as good or beneficial is the product of a triangulation and represents a minor gate: attraction, beauty, success, virtue, compassion, happiness, wisdom, and fulfillment. All of them. The first major gate is our entire concept of good and evil, positive and negative. It is a body-focused duality. The second major gate is the duality of logic and faith, reason and intuition. It is a mind-focused duality. The third major gate is represented by a split of consciousness itself, consciousness directed at the mind and consciousness directed at awareness. Mind observer and awareness observer. This duality is focused on beingness, essence. To fully reconcile this last duality is to move into absolute awareness itself, cosmic consciousness, enlightenment. This is the whole trip. The number of individuals who have completed the whole trip, however, is exceedingly rare. 1 in a million perhaps, maybe even less. Each step up the perceptual ladder presents to us new capabilities and powers, but also temptations. These temptations come to us in the form of pleasure. This pleasure may not always be easy to spot though, as it can present itself to us in many different forms. Whether it be power for the sake of power, vanity, money, pride, sex, or control, the mind will concoct any number of clever rationalizations to claim these prizes. But the promise and the deception is always the same: that ultimate satisfaction is always outside of oneself. This really is the crux of all duality, that you and true satisfaction are forever separated, split, and that pleasure, as manifested by these various desires, is the only cure. This is the great lie. Truth, and our perception of it, exposes this lie for what it is: error. We move now to the final I am requirement on our list: the life. Ramakrishna, an Indian mystic and yogi from the 19th century, has been quoted as saying, "Keep holy company, and now and then visit God's devotees and holy men." The mind cannot dwell on God if it is immersed day and night in worldliness, in worldly duties and responsibilities. The companionship of the holy and the wise is one of the main elements of spiritual progress. From the Christian tradition and literature, we're given similar counsel. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am with them. Couples who pray together, stay together. These religious expressions all appear to convey more or less the same message. We cite them here because of the fundamental truth that they offer, that there is an advantage to working together in groups with like-minded individuals. We observe that this principle clearly applies to the business world as well. Requests to schedule a meeting, put our minds together, or simply collaborate all acknowledge this fact, that there is power in group energy. If there wasn't, we simply wouldn't congregate nearly as often, as there wouldn't be any advantage to do so. When this group energy is aligned under a common goal or objective, it gains power. When that goal or objective represents an extremely high ideal, it can become extremely powerful. Gandhi's vision to unite and liberate his native people of India through peaceful protests coalesced a tremendous amount of transformative power. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also had a high ideal, a wonderful dream, and sought peaceful means to achieve it. These individuals inspire and amass great transformative power because they're willing to commit their whole lives towards the pursuit of such a high ideal. When a group of people congregate under no common goal or objective, we refer to them simply as a crowd. When the objective is clearly hostile or negative, a mob can form and the forces unleashed can become extremely destructive. Property can get damaged and people can get hurt or killed. We observe from our own experience that group intent clearly matters, as the energy that it generates can range from anger or outrage as manifested by countless street protests to concern or compassion as exhibited by some activist groups, to camaraderie or brotherhood as expressed by a handful of humanitarian organizations. Generally speaking, the higher the ideal and the more faithfully the members of that group honor that ideal, the more transformative power the group possesses. The mission statement of a group, if truly honored, makes a tremendous difference. But intent, as we have seen, does matter. And even a few words contained within a given slogan can alter the destiny of an entire group. Is the group pro-peace or anti-war? Is it for women or simply against men? The difference is not always clear. 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, among others, are extremely powerful. Operating at the level of unconditional love, these groups have the power to transform the lives of people who are deemed by society as beyond all hope. Doctors Without Borders is yet another example. The energy and influence that groups like this can exert can be very powerful and life-giving, even if these organizations are not usually in the public eye. As a seeker of truth who is looking for others with which to live the life, one must be mindful of this group energy and attempt to discern its motive and intent. Does the group seek to bind you or liberate you? Does it seek to control your actions and behaviors, or do you have free rein to arrive at your own conclusions? Does this group claim to possess secret insights that only it can provide? And are these secrets sold for a price? These and other very important questions should be asked before a serious commitment is made to any group. In the words of the late President Ronald Reagan, we must trust, but verify. Once a group has been selected, it's important to understand the various forces that govern and influence it. These forces, also referred to as spiritual laws, govern human behavior and interaction. If understood and applied correctly, they can be used within a group to accelerate the development of human consciousness, far beyond what could easily be achieved by operating alone. These laws are not strictly spiritual, however, as they can be applied to other domains as well, but they do serve as the basic axioms by which many seasoned seekers tend to operate. To know these laws is to understand the principles that help to shape and influence life itself. To utilize these laws and to speak the truth that they convey is what it means to live the life. Let us evaluate some of these laws now. The first law is called the law of progression. This law states that all of life is evolving from simple to more advanced forms, and that the capabilities for both perception and expression are growing as well. We observe this trend in nature, but also within human development. This process is largely unconscious and driven primarily by the dictates of Mother Nature, that of survival and reproduction. But it can also be consciously directed as well. When it comes to the human experience, this progression manifests itself primarily in the way in which we identify with life. One might start off by identifying solely with their body and its appetites, for example, but then move beyond this self-directed form of identification and focus on emotions of love and family. We call this transition progression because our field of view has been expanded. This process is not linear, though, as one form of identification does not completely supplant another. A more accurate description of the process might be that one form of perception progressively gains more influence than another. Physical appetites and drives, for example, may eventually get subsumed by emotional needs. while emotional needs may in turn get eventually deprioritized in favor of intellectual inquiry that is directed outwards. Intellectual inquiry, on the other hand, could at some point get turned inwards towards philosophic inquiry. Maslow's hierarchy of needs attempts to illustrate this type of development. The law of progression is important because it observes and acknowledges that there are clearly different ways of observing, expressing, and identifying with life, and that these various ways can be loosely categorized. The operative word here being loosely, as there is no perfect framework with which to describe life itself. One simple categorizing system might be to ask if you're primarily a physical person, a feeling person, or a thinking person. Most of us are clearly a combination of all three, and have spent time refining these different modes to varying degrees. We observe here, though, that some specific combinations tend to be more useful than others. Just as a tall person is typically going to be more successful at playing basketball than a short person, we also observe that an introspective and philosophically minded individual will likely have a better chance of reaching ultimate answers than one who does not share any of these characteristics. But it should be stressed that these attributes in no way guarantee success. One can be intellectually brilliant, but completely blind to higher realities. Likewise, one can be highly intuitive, but completely lacking in discernment and fall victim to all manner of falsehood. These attributes are still just tools. It is intention and earnestness that sets the course. One must really want to discover and experience these higher realities. This is what is meant by the quote, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you." The other important takeaway that we gain from the law of progression is that we don't really know where it ends. If we can count to 1,000, then it's reasonable to assume that we can count to 1,001. We don't know where human consciousness culminates, so we must assume that it can continue far beyond our current perceptual capabilities. We use this insight to push on into the unknown. The second law is called the law of the ladder. It builds off the law of progression by acknowledging that different levels of perceptual capability between humans does exist. But it goes a step further by stating that there is a limit to how much one can directly help the conscious evolution of another if their perceptual capacity is too far down the ladder in relationship to us. Put simply, they will not understand what you're trying to communicate, and in all likelihood, they'll think that you're an idiot, naive, dangerous, or worse. They'll misinterpret your insight completely. Despite its current status as an amusing meme, the expression, "don't wake the sleepers," is still apropos. This is not to say that one can't continue helping folks in an indirect way, as supportive and nurturing qualities like love, prayer, friendship, good works, and the like are all very beneficial. Please don't stop doing this. The law of the ladder clearly states that we can only directly help those individuals who are either at our level or one level behind us. On the other hand, we can really only be helped by individuals who are at our level or one level ahead of us. Individuals who are too far beyond our current perceptual development will probably seem crazy. In all probability, we will not understand their motives or behavior. Last but not least, this law also advises that in order to advance up the ladder, one must assist those behind us while simultaneously learning from those ahead of us. Acknowledging this requirement takes us to the third law, the law of karma. Unfortunately, this law has often been distorted to mean do good stuff, or else. You better watch out, you better not cry, you better not pout, I'm telling you why. While this advice is probably instructive for young children, and especially for young mothers who would wish to impress upon their child the need to behave, this more punitive presentation of the law is not really accurate. Karma is neither punitive or rewarding. It just is, like physics. Simply stated, the law of karma claims that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. In other words, we get what we give, or rather, we don't get what we don't give. But this reaction is not constrained by time. This is an important point, and one that is often forgotten or ignored. The reaction could happen almost instantly, or many years from now. We don't know. But what we do know is that if we give in a targeted and concise manner, in a way that seeks to elevate the consciousness and understanding of another, and is directed towards those specific individuals who have the capacity to receive it, and they also want to receive it, this exact same help will eventually be given to us. And it is this assistance that will help move us up the ladder. Now that we're familiar with the law of progression, the law of the ladder, and the law of karma, we move now to the fourth law, the law of attraction. The law of attraction has gained quite a bit of recognition over the years as being the magic genie of wish fulfillment. Books like The Secret have discussed this law in great detail. While it is true that what you do hold in mind does tend to manifest, what is also true is that the law works in proportion to the level of power or consciousness that an individual or group possesses. The irony here is that once an individual reaches a sufficiently sophisticated point of observation where they could more effectively use the law to attract any number of hedonistic delights, they usually don't, as their interests by this point have moved on to more interesting endeavors. As a seeker of truth, we use this law instead to bring us into association with like-minded seekers, mentors, or teachers. We seek their association by holding this intent in mind. Once we find this group and are surrounded by the holy company of which Ramakrishna and others have spoken about, we can start putting the law of the ladder and the law of karma into practice more efficiently. Once we truly start living the life and putting into practice the requirement of both giving and receiving as outlined by the previous laws, we will start recognizing the wisdom of the fifth law, the law of faith. This law acknowledges that what we need in order to grow has already been anticipated, and what we need will come during the appointed time. In fact, there is no way to prevent it from coming, as the law of karma, of giving and receiving, is simply how the universe operates. It is the very mechanism by which we grow. Most of us sense this intuitively, but we must be patient and keep the faith, as it were, during these waiting periods. It is during these periods, while we are keeping the faith, that we observe the sixth law, the law of proportional returns. This law states that the more effort we exert, that of sufficient quality, the faster our consciousness grows, and the shorter these waiting periods tend to become. Our output is proportional to the effort. This effort is amplified even further when we align ourselves with a group of like-minded individuals, united by a singular purpose and dedicated to a set of high ideals. Once we get settled and begin moving faster and faster through these new levels of perception, we start observing a strange phenomenon, that what we once held as good is now perceived as bad, and what we once thought of as bad is now seen as good. Curiously, we may observe this flip-flopping multiple times throughout our own lives. When we witness this strange shift, we are observing the seventh law, the law of the paradox. The law of the paradox observes that as our field of view grows, and as our identification with life shifts, either temporarily or permanently, the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that we hold dear and regard as good change as well. Sometimes the shift can be so dramatic that what we once regarded as good is now seen as bad, or vice versa. To the individual whose focus rests entirely on the body, on pleasure and physical drives, good may be perceived solely as the fulfillment of desire. Anyone or anything that stands in the way of that fulfillment is seen as bad, something to be resisted. To the individual whose focus has now shifted to work or family, towards a sense of emotional fulfillment, duty, responsibility, and self-sacrifice are now perceived as ennobling, as good. To pursue pleasure just for its own sake would seem petty. To do so would be regarded as distasteful, as bad. This reversal of our conception of good and evil doesn't stop here though, but actually continues on up the ladder, switching back and forth multiple times, aligning with whatever paradigm we happen to reside in. Our sense of good and evil aren't the only perceptions to get reversed though, as all of our dualistic notions about the world are impacted by this law and are subject to change radically and even reverse as we grow in consciousness. This is the paradox of life and of our existence. To recognize this paradox is to be aware of our existential dilemma. To be or not to be, that really is the question. Should we align completely with that which we currently experience to be true? Or should we not align with this truth, knowing that it's subject to change? In order to be authentic, we must honestly adhere to our own truth and reality as we now perceive it, but we must also learn to leave ourselves open enough so as to adjust to newer, more expansive realities. Like the phoenix that dies only to be reborn again and again, we too must figure out how to walk the razor's edge between both. To be and not to be at the same time, that is the answer. Having arrived at last to the starting line, and understanding more clearly now the real work involved with this process of becoming, we see our path stretch out before us, far off into the distance. Time, we discover, is short, and the journey is long. It is also oftentimes painful, challenging, and very confusing. More than anything, we desire friends and loved ones to accompany us on the trip. We arrive now at the last spiritual law, the only thing that can make this quest more bearable, the law of love and friendship. The law of love and friendship is not really a law at all, though. It is rather a quality of pure awareness itself. It is intrinsic to our very existence. Love and friendship are not to be confused with attachment, desire, or gain, however, for in its highest expression, this quality is what we have always intuited it to be. It is patient, it is kind, it does not boast, and it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, nor is it self-seeking. It is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrongs. It does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. To become this quality fully is to live the life. Inscribed on the temple of the Oracle of Delphi are the words, "Know thyself." Throughout this series, we have been struggling to do just that, to understand and implement this command, which was given to us over 3,500 years ago. We began our journey humbly, simply, by asking the most basic of questions. What are we? And what do we really know for certain? For if we're going to know thyself fully, as the oracle has requested, we at least need to know where we stand. As it turns out, we don't really know that much. Certainly not as much as we might expect. Not only do we not know who or what we really are, but somewhere along the way we discovered that we've been programmed. The game of life has been fixed, and we've been instructed to be fruitful and multiply, and then make way for the next batch. For what ultimate purpose we don't know, But our situation does not appear that good. We don't seem to have much of a choice in the matter. We do have some latitude available to us, though. It would seem that the programmer left us with just enough leeway to become something more, to sidestep nature's plan, but only if we're clever, curious, and persistent enough to investigate the matter further. Taking a few steps down the road, we discovered some ways in which we could enhance our bodies and our mental faculties. We learned the truth about our distorted perceptions and how to circumvent them. And we also uncovered strategies to live life more fully by working in teams so as to amplify our powers and broaden the search. But the mind is crafty and stubborn. It does not want to know itself, it would seem, and it resists our efforts at every turn. We've been saddled with an instrument that tires easily, distorts our perceptions almost completely, and generates clever rationalizations to slow us down or throw us off the trail. And even if we manage to overcome all of these obstacles, it still baits us with promises of pleasure, of power and vanity, pride, bliss, exclusivity and specialness, compensations that would seek to trap our attention completely, preventing us from continuing the search. Whatever freedom the programmer might have given us to become more, they certainly didn't make it easy. Assuming that somehow we managed to move beyond all of these hardships and temptations, we learn that even the rules of the game seem to change at various stages, confounding us almost completely. For as we move closer and closer to the source, we're confronted with one paradox after another. Nothing is certain, including our sense of reality. The only sensible course, it would seem, is to reject all beliefs and assumptions and continue the journey on, alone. One might wonder why anyone would choose such an arduous, confusing, and frustrating path through life. Why bother playing this game at all? It seems like far too much trouble. Author and biochemist Robert Raindrops tries to address this question by stating that at one time or another, we all ask ourselves, what do I want to do with my life? What games do I want to play? Whatever decision we happen to make, seek above all a game worth playing, he advises. And having found that game, play it with intensity. Play as if your life and sanity depended on it, for it surely does. Raindrops clearly thought a lot about games, and especially about the type of games that human beings end up playing with their entire lives. There are the low games that would have us chasing wealth, fame, or glory. According to him, these games all lead to dissatisfaction and disillusionment in the end. There's the neutral, or middle game, that of the householder. It is a biological game, and family is the reward. And then there are the high games that involve the pursuit of beauty, as defined by the game called art, knowledge, defined by the game called science, and salvation, defined by the game called religion. The rewards from each of these games are all highly sought after and prized, but the competition is fierce. One game in particular, though, stands out above the rest. Raindrops called it the game of royalty, of kings and queens, and in the final analysis, perhaps the only game really worth playing, the master game. Self-inquiry, the quest to know what we really are, is that master game, although it has been called by many names over the centuries. But this game isn't about self-improvement. We're not trying to learn some mental trick to become better at school or work, or fixate on some positive affirmation to become more successful or wealthy, knowledgeable or attractive, or even turn our energies towards becoming excessively virtuous into what society labels as a good person. And yet in our pursuit, all of these things may come to pass. We are instead striving to discover reality, to first reach the gate of consciousness which we call the I Am, and then pass through it. It is a journey to both know and become that which we truly are. But we must put in the work and climb the ladder to this state one rung at a time. And yet, as Jesus intimated, we can't do our way to this place, think our way to this truth, or even act through good works our way to this life. This may be the most challenging paradox of all. It is the dawning realization that all of our efforts to make this transformation are ultimately futile, useless, and yet our effort is all that we have, and so we must offer it completely. The last duality that stands before us is life and death, and in order to transcend it, we must live fully, in every possible way that we know and sincerely believe to be true and authentic. And yet we must also die fully to any hope and belief that our effort will ever save us and can ever really help us. Maximum effort towards becoming, coupled with maximum hopelessness towards ever succeeding, this is the final triangulation. This is the magic key that opens the door to ultimate reality. It is the final death that reduces us to absolutely nothing, yet allows us to pass through the eye of the needle and meet the Father at last. Pythagoras, a philosopher, mathematician, and mystic from the 5th century BC, elaborated a bit more on the oracle's famous quote, "Know thyself, and you shall know the universe and God." That is the promise and the prize of this final game. Know yourself fully, and you will know what you really are.